Her father told her to never come back. He said it standing in the doorway of the house she'd grown up in, the house with the yellow shutters and the cracked bird bath in the front yard, the house where she'd learned to walk and read and pray and beg. He said it with his jaw set and his eyes dry and his hand gripping the doorframe like he was the one who needed steadying. She was 17 years old, 5 months pregnant, holding a backpack with everything she owned inside it. She expected anger, so she expected silence. What she didn't expect was the lock turning behind her before she'd even reached the sidewalk. Her name was Josephine Claire Whitmore, and she was born on a Tuesday in March of 1986 in a town called Harlan Crossing, North Carolina, a place that existed at the intersection of tobacco fields and Pentecostal churches, where everybody knew everybody and nobody admitted to knowing anything that mattered. Harlan Crossing had one grocery store, one gas station, or 2 churches that competed for the same congregation, and a population of roughly 3,200 people who stayed because leaving felt like a betrayal of something they couldn't name. The town sat in a low valley between 2 ridges of the Blue Ridge foothills, and in the fall the whole place turned amber and gold and smelled like wood smoke and dying leaves, and in the winter the fog settled into the valley floor and didn't lift until noon, and sometimes not even then. The Whitmores were not wealthy, but they were respected, which in Harlan Crossing meant more. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, managed the farm supply store on Route 14, a job he'd inherited from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, and this lineage gave Gerald a sense of permanence and authority that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the belief that he was embedded in the bedrock of the town itself. He was a tall man, 6'2", and with hands that were always cracked at the knuckles and a voice that carried the particular gravity of men who rarely raise it. He wore the same rotation of 4 flannel shirts from September through April, and he read the King James Bible every morning at 5:15 a.m. at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that he never finished. He did not believe in ambiguity. He did not believe in second chances. He believed that a person's character was established by the age of 12, and that everything after that was either confirmation or betrayal of what had already been decided. Her mother, Diane Whitmore née Parsons, was a quieter presence, a woman who had once been funny and sharp and who had been slowly worn down into a kind of anxious gentleness by 30 years of marriage to a man who mistook rigidity for righteousness. Diane had wanted to be a school teacher, and she'd completed 2 years at the community college in Asheville before Gerald proposed, and the proposal was understood by everyone, including Diane, as the end of that particular ambition. She kept her textbooks in a box in the attic. She never mentioned them. But Josephine found them once when she was 9 years old, exploring the dusty corners above the hallway ceiling, and she opened one, an anthology of American poetry, and found her mother's handwriting in the margins, small and precise and full of exclamation marks and underlined passages and the occasional word "yes" written next to a stanza. It was the most alive version of her mother Josephine had ever encountered, and it existed only in pencil marks on yellowed pages in a box no one was supposed to open. Josephine was their only daughter. There had been a son, Thomas, born 4 years before her, but Thomas had died at 11 months of a congenital heart defect that no one in Harlan Crossing had the equipment or the knowledge to detect in time. Gerald never spoke about Thomas. Diane kept a single photograph of him in a drawer in her nightstand, not displayed, not framed, just folded into a piece of tissue paper as if it was something fragile that might crumble under the weight of being seen. The loss of Thomas did something to the architecture of the family. It made Gerald harder. It made Diane more afraid. And it made Josephine, from the moment she was old enough to understand the shape of what was missing, feel that she was both desperately wanted and somehow insufficient, that she was loved not entirely for who she was, but partially for who she had to replace. She was a good student. She was a quiet girl with dark hair and serious eyes who sat in the front row and turned in her homework early and volunteered at the church food pantry on Saturdays because her father expected it and her mother hoped it would keep her safe from the undefined dangers that Diane sensed everywhere. Josephine played clarinet in the school band. She liked biology. She had a gift for growing things. She maintained a small garden behind the house where she grew tomatoes and marigolds and, improbably, a rose bush that produced blooms of such deep red they looked almost black in certain light. Gerald tolerated the garden. Diane loved it. The rose bush was the one thing Josephine and her mother shared that belonged entirely to them, and on summer evenings they would sit on the back porch and look at it and not say very much, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. She met Caleb Mercer in the fall of her junior year, so he was new to Harlan Crossing, which was unusual. People didn't move to Harlan Crossing. They were born there or they weren't. His family had come from somewhere in Virginia, and his father worked at the lumber processing plant on the other side of the ridge. Caleb was 18, a senior with sandy hair and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only interesting thing in a room full of uninteresting things. He was charming in the specific way that certain young men are charming, not through effort, but through attention. He listened. He asked questions. He remembered what you said 3 weeks ago and brought it up again as if your words had mattered enough to carry. For a girl who had spent her whole life feeling like a replacement for someone who had died, being noticed, truly, specifically noticed, was intoxicating. They started dating in October. They kept it quiet, and not because they were ashamed, but because Josephine understood instinctively that her father would not approve. Gerald Whitmore did not know Caleb's family. Gerald Whitmore did not know Caleb's father's people. And in Gerald's moral universe, an unknown quantity was an untrustworthy one. So Josephine and Caleb met at the library, at the diner on Route 7, in the parking lot behind the school after band practice. They talked for hours. She told him things she had never told anyone. About the box of poetry books in the attic, about the photograph of Thomas folded in tissue paper, about the way her father's silence could fill a room like water filling a basement, rising slowly until you couldn't breathe. Caleb listened to all of it. And then one night in January, in the back seat of his father's truck parked on a logging road above the valley, they did what 17-year-olds in love have done since the beginning of time. And then Josephine felt, for the first time in her life, that she existed as something other than a daughter, a replacement, a role. She existed as herself. She found out she was pregnant in March, 11 weeks along. She took the test in the bathroom of the gas station on Route 14 because she couldn't do it at home. And she sat on the closed toilet lid with the plastic stick in her hand and stared at the 2 pink lines and felt the world reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. But she was terrified. She was 17. She had $117 in a savings account at the credit union. She didn't know what to do. She told Caleb first, on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting on the hood of his truck in a church parking lot. He went pale. He was quiet for a long time, 47 seconds, she counted them. And then he said, "I don't know what to do either, but I'm not going anywhere." And for a brief, shimmering moment, she believed him. She told her mother next. Diane Whitmore received the news the way she received all news that threatened the fragile order of her life, with a sharp inhalation, a hand pressed flat against her sternum, and a long silence that was not thoughtful, but paralyzed. Diane didn't yell. Diane didn't comfort. Diane said, "Your father can't know about this. We'll figure something out." And Josephine watched her mother begin the familiar process of trying to manage Gerald's reality rather than confronting it, as she felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost physical. The exhaustion of watching someone you love choose fear over truth, again and again and again, until the choosing becomes indistinguishable from who they are. But Gerald found out. He found out because Harlan Crossing was 3,200 people, and a girl buying a pregnancy test at the gas station on Route 14 was not the kind of thing that stayed secret for long. Brenda Cahill, who worked the register, mentioned it to her sister, who mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it to Gerald at the farm supply store on a Thursday morning in April, not with malice, but with the particular concern of small-town men who believe that delivering difficult news is the same thing as caring. Gerald came home that evening. He didn't raise his voice. He stood in the kitchen doorway and asked Josephine one question. "Is it true?" And she said yes. And then the world she had known ended. He didn't hit her. Aunt Gerald Whitmore had never hit anyone in his life, and this was a fact he was proud of, as if the absence of physical violence was the same as the presence of love. What he did was worse in some ways, because it was deliberate and articulate and delivered with the calm authority of a man who believed he was acting on principle rather than rage. He told her she had disgraced the family, He told her she had disgraced herself. He told her that he had raised her to know right from wrong, and that she had chosen wrong, and that choices had consequences, and that the consequence of this choice was that she could no longer live under his roof. He said all of this standing in the kitchen where she had eaten breakfast every morning of her life, in front of the refrigerator covered with coupons and church bulletins, and a magnetic calendar from the farm supply store with his name printed at the bottom. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. Diane stood behind him, against the counter, gripping a dish towel with both hands, and said nothing. Not one word. Not please, not wait, not she's our daughter. Nothing. Josephine went upstairs and packed a backpack. She took 3 changes of clothes, her toothbrush, $43 in cash from the jar on her dresser, a paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that had been her favorite since 8th grade, right, and a photograph of her mother standing in the garden next to the rose bush, squinting against the sun. She did not take anything that belonged to her father. She did not take anything from Thomas's drawer. She came downstairs and walked to the front door, and Gerald was standing there, holding it open, and as she passed him, she looked up at his face and searched it for something. Doubt, pain, regret. Anything that suggested this was hard for him. And what she saw was a man who had already decided that this moment was not a failure of love, but a triumph of principle. And she walked out, and the door closed, and the lock turned, and she stood on the front porch of the house with the yellow shutters at 7:43 p.m. on a Thursday in April, 17 years old and 5 months pregnant, and she did not cry. She did not cry because crying required the belief that someone might hear you, and she no longer believed that. She walked to Caleb's house. It took her 34 minutes. She walked along Route 14 in the blue-gray dusk, past the farm supply store and the gas station, and the church where she had been baptized at age 9, and she arrived at the small rental house where the Mercers lived, and she knocked on the door, and Caleb's mother answered, and Josephine said, "My father kicked me out." And Caleb's mother, a thin woman named Sharon with tired eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, looked at her for a long moment and said, "Come in, sweetheart. Sit down." And Josephine sat down at the Mercer's kitchen table, and someone handed her a glass of water, and for the first time that evening, her hands started to shake. She stayed with the Mercers for 11 days. Sharon Mercer was kind in the way that people who have suffered are kind, without judgment, without conditions, one with the quiet understanding that the world breaks people and that the least you can do is offer a chair and a meal while they figure out how to stand back up. But on the 12th day, Caleb's father, Roy Mercer, came home from the lumber plant and sat down at the table and explained, with genuine discomfort and without meeting Josephine's eyes, that they couldn't keep her. They had their own problems. Money was tight. 2 bedrooms for 4 people was already 1 bedroom short. Roy wasn't cruel about it. He was just honest about his limits in a way that Gerald Whitmore would never have been honest about his. And Caleb, who had said, "I'm not going anywhere," sat at that table and looked at his hands and said nothing, not one word. And Josephine understood, with a clarity that felt like swallowing ice, that she was alone. Not abandoned the way her father had abandoned her, with the door and the lock and the declaration. Abandoned the way most people abandon each other, silently, passively, by simply not being strong enough to stay. She left the Mercer's house with her backpack and $27 in cash. She'd spent $16 on prenatal vitamins at the pharmacy, paying with crumpled bills and avoiding the cashier's eyes. And she walked to the only other place she could think of, which was the Harlan Crossing Community Church. Not to pray, to sleep. The church had a covered porch with a bench, and it was May now. Warm enough to sleep outside if you had a sweatshirt and didn't mind the mosquitoes. She slept on that bench for 2 nights. On the 2nd night, she was found by a woman named Alma Reeves. Alma Reeves was 67 years old. She was a retired nurse who had worked for 31 years at the county hospital in Marion and who had moved back to Harlan Crossing after her husband died because the house she'd grown up in was paid off and her pension was modest, and she preferred the company of mountains to the company of most people. She was a small woman, barely 5'3", with silver hair cut short and practical, and hands that moved with the confident economy of someone who had spent 3 decades starting IVs and changing dressings and holding the hands of people who were dying. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she carried a flashlight when she walked at night because the streetlights in Harlan Crossing were spaced too far apart to be useful. She found Josephine on the church bench at 9:40 p.m. on a Wednesday, curled on her side with her backpack under her head. And she stood there for a moment, flashlight in hand, and then she said, in a voice that was neither pitying nor surprised, "How far along are you?" Josephine opened her eyes. 5 months, she said. Alma nodded. She clicked off the flashlight. She said, "Come with me. I've got a spare room and I just made soup." And Josephine, who had spent the last 13 days learning that help was temporary and love was conditional, and that the people who were supposed to protect you were often the first ones to let you fall. Josephine followed this stranger into the dark because the alternative was staying on a bench, and because something in Alma Reeves's voice carried the particular authority of women who have seen everything and decided to be kind anyway. Alma's house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that smelled like onions and dried rosemary, and it sat on a quarter-acre lot at the end of Persimmon Lane, 7 blocks from the church. The spare room had a single bed with a quilt that Alma's mother had made in 1957 and a window that looked out onto a backyard where nothing grew except clover and dandelions. Alma gave Josephine a bowl of soup, potato and leek, from scratch, or in a tin cup because all the bowls were in the dishwasher, and Josephine ate it sitting on the edge of the bed, and the warmth of it moved through her body like something she'd forgotten existed. Alma sat in the doorway and watched her eat, and didn't ask questions. Not that night. That night, all she said was, "The bathroom's down the hall. Towels are in the closet. Don't worry about tomorrow yet." Josephine stayed with Alma Reeves for 7 months. She stayed through the summer, through the thick green heat of July when the cicadas screamed in the trees and the valley felt like the inside of a mouth, and she stayed through the cooling of September and the turning of the leaves and the arrival of October with its wood smoke and its slant of amber light. Alma did not ask Josephine about her family. Alma did not ask about Caleb. Alma asked practical questions. Have you seen a doctor? Do you need vitamins? Can you read? So that last question wasn't condescending. Alma asked it because she had spent 31 years watching people suffer from problems that could have been avoided if someone had simply given them the right information at the right time, and she believed that knowledge was the most practical form of love. When Josephine said yes, she could read, so Alma went to the bookshelf in the living room and pulled down a copy of What to Expect. When You're Expecting that was so dog-eared and annotated it looked like it had been used to teach a class, and she said, "Read chapters 4 through 12. Write down your questions. We'll go through them on Saturday." And they did. Every Saturday morning, Josephine and Alma sat at the kitchen table and went through Josephine's questions about pregnancy and childbirth and newborn care, whereas Alma answered them with the directness and specificity of someone who had delivered more than 200 babies during her career and who believed that fear was most effectively combated with information. Alma drove Josephine to prenatal appointments at the county clinic in Marion, a 40-minute drive each way, and she sat in the waiting room reading paperback mysteries, and she never complained about the gas or the time. Alma taught Josephine how to budget, how to stretch $20 across a week of meals, how to buy in bulk, how to cook rice and beans in 7 different ways, so you didn't lose your mind eating the same thing every night. Alma taught Josephine how to sew, basic stitches, enough to repair clothes and hem pants, and eventually to make a small blanket for the baby from fabric scraps that Alma kept in a basket under the sewing table. And during those 7 months, yet something happened that neither of them named or discussed directly. They became family. Not the family Josephine had been born into, not the family of obligation and expectation and the constant low hum of disappointment, but a different kind. A family built on the daily accumulation of small, reliable acts of care. Alma cooked, Josephine cleaned, Alma drove. Josephine weeded the clover patch in the backyard and planted, without asking permission, a row of marigolds along the fence. And Alma looked at them through the kitchen window and didn't say anything, but she smiled in a way that rearranged her whole face. They watched Jeopardy together every evening at 7 o'clock. Alma was better at history. Josephine was better at science. They kept a running tally on a notepad stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet, and by October, Josephine was winning by 11 points, and Alma accused her of cheating, and Josephine laughed, really laughed, or the kind that comes from the belly and surprises you. And it was the first time she had laughed like that since before the pregnancy test, before the gas station, before the lock turning in the door. The baby was born on November 14th, 2003, at 3:17 a.m. at the county hospital in Marion. A girl, 6 pounds, 9 ounces, a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the delivery room like a siren. Josephine named her Clara Whitmore, not Mercer. Whitmore, because whatever Gerald Whitmore had done, the name was Josephine's too, and she refused to let him take it from her. Alma was in the delivery room. She held Josephine's hand during the contractions and told her when to push and when to breathe and when it was almost over. And when Clara emerged into the world, red and furious and perfect, Alma cut the cord herself. The nurses let her. Because she was Alma Reeves and she had delivered babies in that same hospital for 3 decades, and everyone there knew her and respected her and understood that this particular birth was not just medical, but personal. Alma held Clara for 11 seconds before handing her to Josephine, and in those 11 seconds something passed between the old woman and the infant. Not a look, because Clara's eyes were barely open, but a transfer of something. A promise made without words. Chu, I'll watch over her. I'll watch over both of you. Josephine was 17 years old. She had a newborn daughter, a GED she'd earned studying at Alma's kitchen table, $212 in savings, no job, no car, no family, except an elderly retired nurse who owed her nothing and gave her everything. She was terrified. She was exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. And she was, for the first time since the night she'd walked out of the house with the yellow shutters, at something she didn't yet have a word for. It wasn't happiness, not confidence exactly, not peace, something more fundamental than either. It was the feeling of having someone who depended on her completely, this small, breathing, impossibly fragile person, and discovering that the weight of that dependence didn't crush her. It steadied her. It gave her a center of gravity she'd never had before. Clara needed her, and that need was not a burden, but a blueprint, a reason to do the next thing. Yupo, and the next thing, and the next thing after that. Josephine got her first job 6 weeks after Clara was born. Waitressing at a diner called Mabel's on Route 7, the same diner where she and Caleb had once sat in a booth sharing onion rings and talking about what they wanted to be when they grew up. She worked the morning shift, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., and Alma watched Clara. She earned $4.75 an hour plus tips, and the tips at Mabel's were modest. Harlan Crossing was not a town of generous tippers, but she averaged $35 to $40 a day, and she saved everything she could, which was not much, but it was something. It was $80 a week, then $100 when she picked up an extra Saturday shift. She kept the money in a mason jar on the shelf in Alma's spare room, and she counted it every Sunday night, and the act of counting it, of watching the number grow, slowly, painfully slowly, but grow, was the closest thing to hope she had. She enrolled in community college the following September. Clara was 10 months old. Josephine drove Alma's car, a 1994 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles on it, to the campus in Marion 3 days a week, and she took classes in the morning and waitressed in the afternoon and studied at night after Clara was asleep. And she slept an average of 4.5 hours a night for 2 years, and she never missed a class, and she never missed a shift. And she never missed a bedtime with Clara. She studied nursing. She chose it not because Alma told her to. Alma never told her what to do, only what was possible, but because she had watched Alma care for her with such competence and such steady, unsentimental love that she understood for the first time that caring for people could be a profession and not just a sacrifice, that you could be paid to do what Alma did for free, and that the skills of attention and patience and the ability to remain calm while someone was in pain, the skills Alma had shown her every single day, were valuable. Were, in fact, among the most valuable things in the world. She got her nursing degree in 2007. An associate's degree, 2 years of classes and clinical rotations and exams she studied for at the kitchen table after Clara was asleep, the same table where she'd once sat with her questions about pregnancy written on a legal pad. See, Alma came to the graduation ceremony. She wore a blue dress that Josephine had never seen before and earrings that caught the light, and she sat in the third row of the auditorium, and when Josephine's name was called, Josephine Claire Whitmore, Alma stood up and clapped, and she was the only person in the auditorium standing. And Josephine looked at her from the stage, and something broke open in her chest that she had been holding closed for 4 years, and she cried. Not the silent, not the controlled tears of someone trying to maintain composure. The other kind. The kind that comes from being seen, from being claimed, from knowing that someone is proud of you and that their pride is not conditional, not contingent on your performance or your obedience or your ability to replace someone who died before you were born. Alma was proud of her because she had survived, because she had shown up, because she had done the work, and that was enough. She got a job at a hospital in Asheville. Our registered nurse, medical surgical floor, starting salary of $38,400 a year. She found an apartment, 2 bedrooms, in a complex on the north side of the city, with a playground visible from the kitchen window. She and Clara moved in on a Saturday in August, and Josephine stood in the empty living room with boxes stacked around her. And Clara, who was almost 4 now and had her mother's dark hair and her mother's serious eyes and a laugh that was entirely her own, stood next to her and said, "She at the playground below," and said, "There at the playground below," and said, "There are swings." And her voice carried the particular wonder of a child who has never before had something that was hers. Roint and Josephine stood behind her daughter and put her hands on her small shoulders and made a promise to herself that she did not say out loud, but that governed every decision she made for the next 14 years. "I'm going to give you everything." She worked. She worked with the quiet, relentless intensity of someone who understood that the distance between stability and catastrophe was measured in missed shifts and unpaid bills. He had a particular ability, learned from Alma, refined through experience, to be calm in the presence of suffering. Patients liked her. Doctors trusted her. She was promoted to charge nurse in 2011, then to nurse manager of the surgical floor in 2014, and her salary rose to $62,000, then $71,000. When she moved to a better apartment, and then to a small house, rented, not owned, with a yard where Clara could play and where Josephine planted, in the southeast corner where the light was best, a rose bush. She never went back to Harlan Crossing. She drove to Persimmon Lane to visit Alma every other Sunday, a 45-minute drive each way, and she brought Clara, and they sat in Alma's kitchen and ate soup and watched Jeopardy and kept the running tally on the refrigerator. By 2010, Aunt Gerald Whitmore had told her to never come back. She never looked up her father's name. She never called. Gerald Whitmore had told her to never come back, and Josephine, who had inherited his stubbornness if nothing else, took him at his word, not out of obedience, out of something harder and more complicated than obedience, out of the refusal to beg for something that should have been given freely, or out of the understanding that love offered with conditions is not love but leverage, and that she would rather build a life from nothing than accept a life built on the requirement that she pretend to be someone she wasn't. But the absence of her family was not the same as the absence of pain. The absence was its own kind of presence, a negative space in the shape of parents, of a hometown, of a history. It followed her. It sat in the empty chair at Clara's birthday parties. So gratitude, the bewildering ache of knowing gratitude, the bewildering ache of knowing that her own mother was alive, 45 minutes away, and had not called. Not once. Not in 4 years, not in 8, not in 12. Diane Whitmore had Josephine's phone number. Josephine had given it to Alma, who had passed it along through a chain of mutual acquaintances, ensuring that Diane had every opportunity to reach out. She never did. And Josephine learned to live with that the way you learn to live with a chronic condition. Not by curing it, but by accommodating it, by arranging your life around the pain so that it doesn't prevent you from functioning, even though it never fully goes away. Clara grew up. She grew up in Asheville, in the rented house with the rose bush in the yard, and with a mother who worked too much and loved fiercely and read to her every night until she was 9, and then sat next to her every night while she read to herself until she was 12. Clara was smart. She was observant. She had her mother's seriousness, but also a streak of irreverence that Josephine recognized as coming from somewhere else. Not from Gerald, not from Diane, but from some deeper well of genetic mischief that had skipped a generation or two and surfaced in this girl who could make her mother laugh with a single raised eyebrow. Clara asked about her father once, when she was 7. Josephine told her the truth, as much of it as a 7-year-old could hold. He was a boy I knew in high school. He wasn't ready to be a dad. It wasn't his fault, and it wasn't yours. See, Clara accepted this with the pragmatism of a child who has never known the thing she's being told she's missing. She asked about her grandparents twice. The first time she was 8, and Josephine said, "They live far away and we don't see them." The second time she was 14. She was 14 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and she looked up from her textbook and said, "Mom, how come I've never met your parents?" Not accusatory, not wounded, curious. And Josephine sat down across from her, and who wants to know why hers looks the way it does? And Josephine sat down across from her and looked at this girl. This extraordinary girl who had been born on a bench she never slept on, who had been carried through those first years by a woman she called Grandma Alma, so who had never once been made to feel like a mistake even though her existence had cost her mother everything. And Josephine told her. She told her about Gerald, about Diane, about the door and the lock and the backpack and the $43 in cash. She told her about the church bench and Alma's soup and the tin cup and the quilt from 1957. She told her about Caleb's silence at the kitchen table. She told her about Mabel's diner and the mason jar and the 187,000 miles on the Honda Civic. She told her everything, and when she was done, Clara was quiet for a long time, not 47 seconds like Caleb, but long enough for the silence to develop its own weight. And then Clara said, "He told you to never come back?" And Josephine said, "Yes." And Clara said, "What about Grandma, your mom?" And Josephine said, "She didn't say anything. She stood there and she didn't say anything." And Clara's eyes filled with tears, not for herself, but for her mother. And she reached across the table and took Josephine's hand and held it, and she said, "That's the worst part." And Josephine looked at her daughter and knew she was right. The lock was cruel. The silence was crueler. But Diane standing there, gripping the dish towel, saying nothing, that was the wound that had never closed. Because cruelty from a cruel person can be understood. Silence from someone who loves you cannot. 3 years passed, and Clara turned 17, the same age Josephine had been when she was thrown out, and the symmetry of it was not lost on either of them. Clara was a junior in high school. She was on the debate team. She was applying to colleges. She wanted to study social work. She said she wanted to help families, and when she said it, Josephine heard something underneath the words. A mission statement, a declaration of intent, a promise to fix what had been broken in her own history. Now Josephine was 34 years old. She was the nurse manager of a surgical floor at a major hospital. She had $47,000 in savings. She owned her car outright. She was thinking about buying a house. She was thinking about buying a house when Alma Reeves called her on a Tuesday evening in October of 2020 and said, "Josephine, I need to tell you something, and there are things you need to hear that I've been keeping for a long time." And Josephine sat down on the edge of her bed. So because something in Alma's voice, a new frailty, a new urgency, told her that this was not a conversation about Jeopardy scores. Alma was 84 years old. She had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 weeks earlier. She had not told Josephine immediately because she was Alma Reeves and she processed bad news the way she processed everything, privately, practically, with a period of research and planning before she involved anyone else. But now she was involving Josephine. Because there were things to arrange and things to say and, crucially, things to reveal. "I've been in contact with your mother," Alma said, and the room tilted. "Not recently," Alma continued. "For years. Since the beginning, really. Diane called me 3 weeks after you showed up on that bench. She got my number from Brenda Cahill at the gas station, the same Brenda Cahill who'd started the chain of gossip that led to Gerald finding out about the pregnancy. Brenda, apparently, or had felt guilty enough about her role in what happened to track down where Josephine had ended up and pass the information to Diane, and Diane had called Alma, and they had spoken, and they had continued to speak approximately once a month for 17 years. 17 years of phone calls that Josephine knew nothing about. Josephine's hand tightened on the phone. She said, "What did she say?" And Alma said, "She asked about you. Every time. She asked how you were. She asked about the baby. Then why didn't she come? Why didn't she? Then why didn't she come? Why didn't she call me herself? Why didn't she?" And she stopped because she already knew the answer. Gerald. The answer was Gerald. The answer was always Gerald. Diane Whitmore had spent her entire adult life managing her husband's reality, arranging the world to avoid his displeasure, and the cost of that management was her daughter. And she had chosen her fear over her child, not once, but every single month for 17 years, and the cruelty of it was that she clearly loved Josephine. The phone calls proved that, the crying proved that, but her love was not strong enough to overcome her terror of the man she'd married, and that was a kind of tragedy that Josephine could barely hold in her hands, because it meant that Diane was not a monster. She was something worse. She was a coward who loved her. Alma said, "And there's something else." And Josephine braced. Alma said, "Your father is sick." Gerald had been diagnosed with early onset dementia 2 years ago. He had deteriorated rapidly. Diane was caring for him alone. Alone because Gerald had alienated everyone, because the farm supply store had closed in 2016 when the big chain store opened on the highway. But because the people of Harlan Crossing had drifted away from the Whitmores the way people drift away from families that are no longer useful or visible or powerful. Gerald was 71. He was confused. He was sometimes violent. He had, on more than one occasion, failed to recognize Diane. The house with the yellow shutters, the house Josephine had grown up in, was falling apart. The roof leaked. The porch was rotting. Honey, the bird bath in the front yard had cracked in half during a freeze, and no one had replaced it. And the rose bush, Josephine's rose bush, the one she and her mother had tended together on summer evenings, was dead. Josephine listened to all of this. She listened with her jaw tight and her eyes dry and something inside her chest clenching and releasing, like a fist that couldn't decide whether to open or close. And when Alma was finished, Josephine said, "Why are you telling me this now?" And Alma said, with the directness that had defined every conversation they'd ever had, "Because I'm dying, and your mother is alone, and you need to decide what kind of person you're going to be when the people who hurt you need your help." And then Alma said, "I'm not telling you what to do. I've never told you what to do. But I'm going to tell you one thing, and you can take it or leave it." And she said, "When the phone rings, you answer." Aunt Josephine did not call her mother that night. She did not call her the next night either. She sat with Alma's words for 13 days, turning them over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight, its texture, its temperature. She went to work. She cared for patients, people in pain, people recovering from surgery, people afraid and vulnerable and dependent on the competence and kindness of strangers. And she did her job with the same steady, unhurried attention she always did. Or no one at the hospital knew that she was carrying a decision inside her that felt heavier than anything she'd lifted in years. On the 14th day, Clara came home from school and found Josephine sitting at the kitchen table staring at her phone. And Clara, who was 17 now and who had inherited her mother's capacity for reading silence, sat down across from her and said, "What happened?" And Josephine told her about Alma's cancer. She told her about Diane's phone calls. She told her about Gerald's dementia. She told her about the house. And Clara listened the way Alma had once listened, without interruption, without judgment, with her full attention. And when Josephine was done, Clara said, "We should go. We should go." 3 words, delivered with the uncomplicated moral clarity of a 17-year-old who had spent her whole life learning, from her mother and from Alma, and that kindness was not conditional, and that the measure of a person was not how they treated the people who had treated them well, but how they treated the people who had treated them worst. "We should go." Josephine looked at her daughter and saw herself at 17, the same age, the same serious eyes, but a version of herself that had been raised differently, loved differently, or shaped by Alma's soup and Saturday morning question sessions and Jeopardy and the marigolds along the fence and the steady, unglamorous daily work of being cared for without conditions. Clara was who Josephine might have been if someone had caught her earlier. Clara was the proof that the chain could be broken. They drove to Harlan Crossing on a Saturday in November. The drive took 47 minutes. Josephine had not been on Route 14 in 17 years, and the road was the same and the mountains were the same, but the town was different. Smaller, quieter, half the storefronts on Main Street empty, the farm supply store's sign still hanging above the door, but the windows dark and the parking lot cracked with weeds. The gas station was still there. The church was still there. Mabel's diner was closed. A handwritten sign in the window said, "Thank you for 34 years," and Josephine drove past it and felt the particular sadness of watching the places that formed you become the places that forgot you. She pulled into the driveway of the house with the yellow shutters and she turned off the engine and she sat there. Clara sat beside her. Neither of them spoke. The house was worse than Josephine had imagined. The yellow shutters were gray now, paint peeled down to bare wood. The porch sagged on the left side where a support post had rotted through. The gutters hung at angles. 3 of the front windows were covered with plastic sheeting instead of glass. The bird bath was gone, not cracked as Alma had said, but entirely gone, as if someone had dragged the pieces away and left just a circle of bare earth where it had stood. The yard was overgrown, the grass knee-high. The flower beds that Diane had once maintained with such careful attention now strangled with thistle and crabgrass. And the rose bush, Josephine made herself look at it, was a tangle of dead brown canes, leafless, flowerless, reduced to a skeletal thing that looked less like a plant and more like a scar. She got out of the car. Clara got out beside her. See, 3 times. Firm, even, the way you knock. 3 times. Firm, even. The way you knock when you've decided to stop being afraid of what's on the other side. The door opened and Diane Whitmore stood there. She was 67 years old. She was smaller than Josephine remembered, shrunken somehow, so reduced by years of isolation and caregiving and the slow erosion of being the only person left to hold a crumbling life together. Her hair was white, not gray. White, the kind of white that happens not gradually, but all at once, as if the color had simply given up. She was wearing a housecoat that might have been pink once, but had faded to a dingy gray, and her hands were chapped, and her eyes were the same. Brown, warm, frightened. That's the eyes of a woman who had spent her entire life being afraid and who was now looking at the one thing she was most afraid of, which was not her daughter's anger, but her daughter's face. She said, "Josephine," and Josephine said, "Mom." And Diane's face did something that Josephine had never seen it do. It collapsed. Not into tears, not into a sob, but into a kind of structural failure, as if the muscles that had been holding it in its careful and anxious arrangement for decades simply stopped working all at once, and what was underneath was not composed or controlled, but raw, the face of a woman who had been holding her breath for 18 years and who had just, finally, exhaled. She reached for Josephine with both hands, and Josephine let her, and they stood in the doorway of the house with the gray shutters. They had been yellow once, a long time ago, and they held each other, and Diane said, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," and each repetition sounded different from the last, as if she were apologizing for a different thing each time, for the silence, for the dish towel, for the phone calls she never made, for the years, for the cowardice, for the love that had been real but had never been enough. Clara stood behind them on the porch. She watched her mother hold a woman she had never met, a woman whose silence had shaped the architecture of their lives, and Clara did not judge. She did not harden. So she stepped forward and she put her hand on Diane's shoulder, and Diane looked up and saw her granddaughter for the first time. This girl, this 17-year-old girl whose existence had been the reason for the exile and who was now standing on the porch of the house she'd never been allowed to enter, looking at her grandmother with clear, steady, serious eyes. And Diane said in a whisper, Oh, she's beautiful. She looks like you." And Clara said, "Hi, I'm Clara." Eddie, and the simplicity of it, the unburdened, unweighted simplicity of a name offered without conditions, broke something open in the air between them, and for the first time in 18 years, someone crossed the threshold of that house who was not carrying the weight of Gerald Whitmore's judgment. Gerald was in the living room. He was sitting in a recliner that had been pushed into the corner, facing the television, which was off. He was 71 years old, but he looked 90. His frame, the tall, authoritative frame that had once filled doorways and commanded rooms, had contracted, folded in on itself, as if his body was slowly withdrawing from the world the way his mind already had. His hands, which had once gripped the doorframe while he told his daughter to leave, lay open on the armrests, palms up, fingers slightly curled, in a posture of surrender or supplication or simply absence. His eyes were open but unfocused, and he was wearing a flannel shirt, one of the same four, Josephine thought, or maybe a new one in the same pattern, it was impossible to tell, and it was buttoned wrong, one side higher than the other. Diane said, "He has good days and bad days. Today's not good. He might not know you." Josephine walked to the recliner and knelt down in front of her father. She looked at his face, the face that had been so certain, the face that had expressed no doubt, no regret, or no softening as he told her to leave. That face was still there, underneath the slack muscles and the vacant gaze, but it was like looking at a house through fog. You could see the shape of it, but not the details, and the details were what had made it terrifying. Without the details, the set jaw, the dry eyes, the grip on the doorframe, he was just an old man in a chair who couldn't button his shirt. She said, "Dad, it's Josephine." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not recognition, not exactly, but a ripple, like a stone dropped into water that's almost too still to register the disturbance. He said, "Josephine?" And then, more softly, almost to himself, Josephine used to grow roses. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She opened them. "Yes," she said. "I did. I still do." He nodded slowly, as if this information required careful consideration. Then he said, "They were very red." Jonah and his eyes drifted back to the television that wasn't on, and he was gone again, retreated into whatever interior landscape the dementia had built for him, a landscape where his daughter was not a disgrace, but a girl who grew red roses, and Josephine knelt there on the living room floor of the house she'd been expelled from, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not anger and not forgiveness and not satisfaction. Grief. She grieved. She grieved the father she'd wanted and never had. She grieved the father he might have been if he'd been less afraid, less rigid, less certain that his principles were more important than his child. She grieved the 18 years of silence, his and hers and Diane's. 18 years of people who loved each other sitting in separate rooms, in separate houses, in separate towns, all of them too proud, or too scared, or too broken to pick up the phone. She grieved the rose bush. She grieved the yellow shutters. She grieved the bird bath and the kitchen table and the morning coffee he never finished. She grieved all of it, kneeling on the floor of a house that smelled like dust and illness and the particular staleness of a life that had stopped being lived and was now merely being endured. She stood up. She wiped her eyes. She turned to Diane and said, "How long has it been like this?" Diane told her. 2 years of decline. The first year was subtle. Repeated questions, unforgotten appointments, a growing confusion about sequences. He would start making coffee and forget to add the water. He would drive to the store and forget why he'd come. The second year was worse. He stopped recognizing neighbors. He stopped reading the Bible. Not because he'd lost his faith, but because the words no longer assembled themselves into meaning. He became frightened of the dark. He sometimes called for Thomas. Thomas, who had died at 11 months in 1982. And Diane would sit beside him and hold his hand and not correct him, because what would be the point? The house fell apart around them because Gerald could no longer maintain it, and Diane could not maintain it alone, and there was no one to call. No family, no friends. The people of Harlan Crossing brought a casserole in the first month and then forgot, the way communities do when a crisis becomes chronic and chronic becomes invisible. Josephine said, "Why didn't you call me?" And even as she said it, she knew the answer. Diane looked at her with those brown, frightened eyes and said, "He told you not to come back. And I was afraid that if I called, you'd say no, that you'd refuse, that you'd be right to refuse, and I couldn't survive hearing you say no. So I said nothing." And Josephine heard it. The logic of cowardice, Read the mathematics of a woman who had calculated that the certainty of silence was preferable to the risk of rejection. And she wanted to scream. She wanted to shake her mother by the shoulders and say, "I would have come. I would have come 10 years ago. I would have come the day after he threw me out if you had stood up and said one word, one single word, and you didn't. And now we've lost 18 years that we can never get back, and you did this, you let this happen. On your silence was a choice every single day for 18 years. She wanted to say all of that. But she looked at her mother, this small, white-haired woman in a faded housecoat, standing in a decaying house with a husband who couldn't remember her name, and she understood that Diane had already been punished. Not by God, not by fate, but by the natural consequences of her own choices. She had chosen silence, and silence had given her exactly what it always gives: nothing. An empty house, an empty phone, an empty life. And Josephine could add to that emptiness, or she could do what Alma had done for her on a bench outside a church 20 years ago. She could offer a hand. She said, "I'm here now." Over the next 6 months, Josephine drove to Harlan Crossing every weekend. She brought Clara. She brought cleaning supplies and tools and groceries, and once, so a contractor named Miguel, who owed her a favor from the hospital and who spent 2 Saturdays replacing the rotted porch post and rehanging the gutters. She cleaned the house. She organized Gerald's medications. She taught Diane how to manage the worst of his episodes: the confusion, the agitation, the moments when he didn't know where he was and became frightened and combative in the way that frightened people become when the world stops making sense. She used her nursing training, and she used Alma's training. She used everything she had, and during those 6 months, she also did something else. She began to look at properties in Harlan Crossing. She didn't tell anyone at first, not Diane, not Clara, not Alma, whose cancer was advancing, but who was still alive, still sharp, still keeping a Jeopardy tally on the refrigerator, still answering the phone on the first ring every time Josephine called. So Josephine looked at properties because an idea had taken root in her mind. An idea so audacious and so specific that she was afraid to say it out loud, as if speaking it would make it evaporate. She wanted to buy the house next door. The house next door to the Whitmore property, the house at 412 Persimmon Lane, because the Whitmores had lived at 414, had been empty for 3 years. Its previous owner, an elderly man named Harold Pittman, had died in 2017, and his children, and was a small house, 3 bedrooms, one was a small house, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, a detached garage, and a yard that backed up against the same property line as the Whitmore lot. It was listed at $87,000. It had been listed at $87,000 for 3 years because no one was buying houses in Harlan Crossing, because the town was shrinking. So because the young people left and the old people died and the houses sat empty and decayed and became the kind of properties that real estate listings described as full of potential when what they meant was full of problems. Josephine made an offer of $72,000 in cash. She used $47,000 from savings and took a small loan for the rest. The sellers accepted within 48 hours. And on a Friday afternoon in May of 2021, Josephine Claire Whitmore, who had been told to never come back, or who had slept on a church bench, who had waitressed at Mabel's Diner for $4.75 an hour plus tips, who had counted money in a mason jar on Sunday nights, who had earned a nursing degree at a kitchen table while her daughter slept in the next room, signed the papers and became the owner of the house next door to the house her father had thrown her out of 18 years earlier. She did not buy the house for revenge. This is important. One, she did not buy it to prove a point, or to rub Gerald's face in what she had become, or to tower over the ruins of the family that had discarded her. She bought it because her mother needed her. Because Gerald, despite everything, was her father, and he was dying in a house that was falling apart, and someone had to help, and the people who should have helped, the community, the church, the neighbors, had not. She bought it because Clara needed to know where she came from. And she bought it because Alma had said, "When the phone rings, you answer." And buying the house next door was Josephine's way of answering. Not the phone, but the question underneath the phone. The question of whether she was the kind of person who could return to the place that had broken her and choose to be whole there. She bought the house because she refused to let Gerald Whitmore's cruelty define the boundaries of her life. He had told her to never come back. She came back. She came back and bought the house next door. Not to defy him, but to prove, to herself, to Clara, to the memory of Alma's tin cup of soup, that the girl who walked out with a backpack and $43 in cash had built something that could not be taken away. Not a fortune, not fame. Something more durable than either. A life. She moved in on a Saturday in June. Clara helped. Alma, by this point, was too sick to make the trip. She was in hospice care in Marion, lucid but fading. Still reading paperback mysteries, still keeping score. But she called Josephine that evening and said, "Tell me about the house." And Josephine described every room, every window, every crack in the plaster, and every creaking floorboard. And Alma listened and said, "It sounds like it needs work." And Josephine laughed and said, "Everything good does." And Alma was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's exactly right." And there was something in the way she said it, a settling, see a release. That told Josephine this was one of their last conversations, and she held the phone tighter and neither of them hung up for a long time. Alma Reeves died on July 3rd, 2021 at 4:12 in the morning in the hospice facility in Marion. Josephine was there. She held Alma's hand. It was the same hand that had held hers during Clara's delivery, the same hand that had clicked off the flashlight on the church porch, sure the same hand that had turned the pages of What to Expect When You're Expecting across the kitchen table on Saturday mornings. Josephine held that hand and felt the pulse weaken and then stop, and she sat there in the quiet room and she said, "Thank you." Not loud, not to anyone who could hear, just to the silence and to the woman who had been the silence's opposite for 20 years. She buried Alma in the cemetery in Harlan Crossing, next to Alma's husband, and beneath a headstone that read, "Alma Jean Reeves, 1936 to 2021, she answered." Josephine chose those words. She chose them because they were the truest thing she could say about a woman who had encountered a pregnant teenager on a church bench and had responded not with pity or judgment or the performative concern that passes for compassion in most people's lives, but with a bowl of soup and a spare room, and the simple, extraordinary willingness to show up every day without conditions, and for as long as it took. She answered. That was Alma's legacy. Not the nursing degree, not the house on Persimmon Lane, not the Jeopardy scores. The answering. The months that followed were the hardest of Josephine's life. Harder than the church bench, harder than the diner shifts, harder than the 4.5-hour nights during nursing school. Harder because they required her to be present in a place saturated with pain, to care for a father who had destroyed her adolescence, to rebuild a relationship with a mother who had watched it happen, and to do all of this while grieving the woman who had made her capable of doing any of it. She woke up every morning at 5:30 in the house at 412 Persimmon Lane. She made coffee. She walked next door. She helped Diane get Gerald dressed and fed and medicated. She cleaned. She cooked. She sat with Gerald when Diane needed to sleep, and she watched him drift in and out of lucidity, and on his good days, which became rarer, he would look at her and say things that she held in her chest like stones. One morning in September, he looked at her and said, "I had a daughter. Her name was Josephine. She left." And Josephine said, "I'm Josephine, Dad." And he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not recognition, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the neighborhood of recognition without quite arriving. And he said, "On Josephine grew roses. I think about those roses. I don't know why she left." And Josephine sat there in the kitchen where he had told her to leave, and she heard him rewrite the story in the only way his broken mind could hold it. Not I threw her out, but she left. Not I locked the door, but she was gone. And she felt the anger she'd carried for 18 years dissolve into something else, something that was not forgiveness and was not resignation, but was, perhaps, the recognition that Gerald Whitmore had been punished in the most precise way possible. He had been a man who valued certainty above all things, and now certainty had been taken from him. He had been a man who controlled every narrative, and now his own narrative had slipped beyond his control. He didn't remember what he'd done. He couldn't repent because he couldn't remember. and Josephine had to decide whether she could forgive a man who couldn't ask for forgiveness and who didn't even know he needed it. She decided she could. Not because he deserved it, not because forgiving him made what he did acceptable. She forgave him because the alternative was carrying his cruelty inside her body for the rest of her life, and she had carried it long enough. 18 years. So she had carried it on the church bench, and in Alma's spare room, and at Mabel's diner, and through nursing school, and into the hospital, and through Clara's childhood, and into the car on the drive back to Harlan Crossing. And it was heavy, and she was tired, and the woman who had taught her to be strong had also taught her, by example, that strength was not the refusal to let go, but the willingness to put something down when it was no longer yours to carry. She forgave Diane too, one though that was harder. Harder because Diane was lucid. Diane knew what she had done. Diane sat across from Josephine at the kitchen table, the same chairs, even the same salt and pepper shakers, and cried and apologized and explained and justified and apologized again, and Josephine listened to all of it and said, "I know you were afraid. I know he was hard to stand up to. I know you called Alma. I know you cried. But you chose him over me. On every day for 18 years you chose him over me. And I need you to say that. Not explain it. Not contextualize it. Say it." And Diane looked at her with those brown, frightened eyes and said, "I chose him over you. Every day. I was wrong." And saying it cost her something visible. Her face aged 5 years in the space of those words. But it was necessary. And Josephine knew it was necessary because Alma had taught her that truth was the only foundation you could build on without it crumbling. And anything built on euphemism or silence would collapse eventually, as surely as a porch post rotted from the inside. Forgiveness was not an event. It was not a single conversation or a single morning or a single sentence spoken across a kitchen table. It was a process, ongoing, imperfect, sometimes interrupted by rage that surfaced without warning in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Rage at the years she'd lost, rage at the garden that had died and was gone. She let it come. She let it was gone. She let it come. She let it pass. She woke up the next morning and walked next door and made coffee and started again. And slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the way a tree grows, the way a house settles, and the way a relationship rebuilds itself, one conversation and one meal and one quiet evening at a time, something began to change. Clara and Diane. That was where the change was most visible. Clara, who had never met her grandmother, who had grown up with the shape of grandparents cut out of her life like figures removed from a photograph. Clara approached Diane with the openness that only someone who has been raised without bitterness can manage. She asked Diane about her life. She asked about the poetry books in the attic. She asked about the teaching degree that never happened. She found the box. It was still there, still in the attic, still dusty, and she brought it down and sat at the kitchen table and read the marginalia aloud, and Diane listened to her own young voice coming back to her through her granddaughter's mouth, and something loosened in her chest that had been knotted for 40 years. Clara asked Diane to teach her to cook. Diane, she suggested the world was larger than Harlan, suggested the world was larger than Harlan Crossing, discovered through Clara's curiosity that she actually liked to cook, that she had opinions about garlic, that she had always wanted to try making risotto. They made risotto together on a Saturday afternoon in October, and they burned it, and they laughed, and the sound of their laughter in that kitchen was so foreign, so unlike anything that house had ever contained, that Josephine stood in the doorway and closed her eyes and let the sound fill her the way the soup had filled her on that first night in Alma's spare room. Gerald Whitmore died on March 7th, 2022. He died in the living room of the house with the shutters that had once been yellow, in the recliner in the corner, with Diane holding one hand and Josephine holding the other. He had not been lucid for weeks. His last coherent sentence, spoken 5 days before his death, was addressed to someone who wasn't in the room. He said, "Thomas, come here, let me see you." And then he smiled, and it was the only smile Josephine had ever seen on her father's face that carried no judgment, no conditions, no assessment. It was the smile of a man greeting his son. And then he was gone. Josephine did not know what to feel. But she sat with his body for 20 minutes after the hospice nurse confirmed the death, and she searched herself for the appropriate emotion: grief, relief, anger, closure, and what she found was none of those things and all of them simultaneously. A feeling too complex for a single word. A feeling that lived in the space between the father who had thrown her out and the old man who remembered her roses. They buried Gerald in the Harlan Crossing Cemetery, 200 yards from Alma's grave. The funeral was attended by 11 people: Diane, Josephine, Clara, the pastor. 7 others, elderly residents of the town who remembered Gerald from the farm supply store and who came out of obligation or habit or the vague sense that someone should be present when a person is lowered into the ground. It was a small funeral for a man who had once believed he was embedded in the bedrock of the town, and the smallness of it said everything that needed to be said about the cost of rigidity and isolation and the slow, inevitable contraction of a life that admits no one. After the funeral, Josephine and Diane stood in the backyard of 414 Persimmon Lane and looked at the dead rose bush. It was March. The canes were gray and brittle. There was no sign of life. But Josephine knelt down and touched the base of the plant where the canes met the soil. And she felt something she wasn't sure she was imagining. A firmness, a resistance, the suggestion that beneath the dead wood there was still root structure, still the infrastructure of a living thing waiting for a reason to try again. She said, "I think we can save it." She didn't mean only the rose bush, but she started with the rose bush. She pruned the dead wood, she amended the soil, compost, bone meal, a careful layer of mulch. She watered it every other day, not too much, not too little, one with the patience and precision that Alma had taught her to bring to everything. And in May, when the Blue Ridge foothills turned green and the fog lifted from the valley floor and the town of Harlan Crossing looked, for a few weeks, the way it had looked in Josephine's childhood, golden and warm and alive with the noise of things growing, a single shoot appeared at the base of the rosebush. Green, thin, impossibly fragile, but alive. It bloomed in July. One rose. It was a single bloom of such deep red it looked almost black in certain light. Josephine found it on a Tuesday morning, walking next door to check on Diane, and she stopped on the property line between the two houses, her house and the house she'd grown up in. And she looked at it, and she stood there for a long time, longer than a single rose would seem to warrant, because it was not just a rose. It was evidence. Evidence that something left for dead could, ought toward the light. Clara graduated from Toward the Light. Clara graduated from high school that spring. She was accepted to 3 universities. She chose the state school in Asheville, close enough to come home on weekends, far enough to build her own life. She majored in social work, as she'd always planned. On the day she left for college, she hugged Josephine in the driveway of 412 Persimmon Lane and said, "Thank you for showing me what it looks like to go back." And Josephine held her daughter, this girl, this woman, this extraordinary human being who had been the reason for the exile and the reason for the return, and she said, "You showed me first." And Clara pulled back and looked at her with those serious dark eyes and said, "Grandma Alma showed both of us." And that was true. And that was the truest thing either of them said that day. Diane moved into 412 Persimmon Lane in the fall of 2022, into the house next door, into Josephine's house. Not because 414 was uninhabitable, Josephine and Miguel the contractor had repaired the worst of it, but because Diane was 70 years old and alone and tired of being alone, and because Josephine had a spare room, and because the distance between the two houses, 18 feet of grass and a property line, was close enough to see each other's kitchen lights and far enough to preserve the boundaries that both of them still needed. Diane brought her clothes and her cooking utensils and the box of poetry books from the attic. She put the books on the shelf in the living room. Not in the attic, on the shelf, where anyone could see them, on where anyone could open them and find the marginalia and the underlined passages and the word "yes" written next to a stanza about wildflowers. The house at 414 Persimmon Lane, the house with the shutters that had once been yellow, was repainted the following spring. Clara came home from college to help. They painted the shutters yellow again. Not the same yellow, a warmer shade, deeper, more gold than lemon, but yellow. The porch was rebuilt. the bird bath was replaced. The rose bush, and which had produced 1 bloom the previous summer, produced 7. And the house, which had been the site of the worst moment of Josephine's life, became something else. Not a monument to what had happened, not a shrine to suffering or forgiveness. A house, just a house. A house that a family had failed in, and a family had returned to, and a family was slowly, carefully, imperfectly making into something that could hold the weight of both the failure and the return. Josephine is 38 years old now. She works as a nurse at a clinic in Marion, a shorter commute, more regular hours, time to tend the garden and visit Diane and call Clara on Wednesday evenings. She's not a saint. She's not a symbol. She's a woman who was thrown out of her home as a teenager and who spent 18 years building a life from scratch, and who came back not because she had forgiven everyone or healed everything, but because she decided that the act of returning was more important than the completeness of the healing. She still has days when the anger surfaces. She still has days when she looks at Diane across the kitchen table and feels the ghost of the dish towel and the silence. She still has days when she drives past the cemetery and thinks about Alma and misses her with an intensity that borders on physical pain. She is not finished. She is not resolved. She is in process, or the way all living things are in process, growing, pruning, amending the soil, waiting for the next bloom. If you're watching this right now, if you're sitting somewhere with a wound that you've been carrying so long, it feels like part of your body, I want you to hear what Alma Reeves said to a girl on a church bench in 2003. She didn't say everything will be okay. She didn't say, I'll fix this. She said, come with me. I've got a spare room and I just made soup. She answered. And that's all she did. She saw someone in pain and she answered. And that answer, that single, practical, unglamorous act of showing up, changed the trajectory of a life. Not through grand gestures, not through miracles, through soup and Saturday mornings and a tin cup and a quilt from 1957 and the daily, exhausting, beautiful work of caring for someone without conditions. You don't need to buy the house next door. You don't need to forgive everyone who hurt you. You don't even need to go back. But when the phone rings, when someone reaches for you, when the moment comes to decide whether you will answer or let it ring, answer. It won't fix everything. It won't undo the years, but it will mean that the chain breaks with you, that the silence stops with you, that the next girl on the bench, your daughter, your neighbor, the stranger you haven't met yet, doesn't sleep there alone. The rosebush at 414 Persimmon Lane bloomed 11 times last summer, deep red, or almost black in certain light. Josephine counted every one.